Let me start by saying a few words about our speaker. So Raymond Malewitz is Associate Professor of English in the School of Writing, Literature and Film at Oregon State University, and he currently is in residence at the American Studies Center as a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Humanities and Social Sciences. He's the author of Practice of Misuse, Ragged Consumerism in Contemporary American Culture from Stanford University Press 2014, and has published essays in journals such as PMLA, Critical Inquiry, Modern Fiction Studies, and Configuration, as well as in more popular news outlets such as the Washington Post. His talk this evening is from his current book project, which presents a new cultural history of animal diseases and their management. So the title of the talk is Bits of Agitation and the Body of the Whole, Animals in COVID-19 Literature. And Ray, the floor is yours.
All right, so let's begin. Although the name for the viral agent that causes COVID-19, which is SARS-CoV-2, might be a relatively obscure term, even a child can recognize its image, a spiky protein shell that calls to mind a sea urchin or a naval mine. You see it right here in the first screen. Inside that tiny shell is an even tinier single strand of RNA, a set of instructions written in the language of 4 molecular base pairs. When our cells meet SARS-CoV-2, they read its message and they find it so irresistible that they copy it again and again, until we're sick of it. We begin passing that same message to other people, and as we shall see, to other animals as well. The resulting cacophony of reading and rewriting has shut down national economies, altered political landscapes, transformed educational systems, and ended millions of human and non-human lives. It's also thrown into relief important questions about community that cultural critics have been grappling with for decades. I want to talk today about the relationship between community and disease. If we define community rather generically as a collection of people joined by the same interests, then in having this conversation, we're entering into a community with other scholars who have also begun to explore the social effects of disease. For example, in her important monograph, Contagious Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative, Priscilla Wald writes that epidemics, quote, compel attention from scientists and the lay public alike, not only because of the devastation they can cause, but also because the circulation of microbes materializes the transmission of ideas. The interactions that make us sick also constitute us as a community. In a much more abstract way, in 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari describe viral outbreaks as models for new ways of thinking about community. These are ways that dovetail directly Wald's characterization. In their complicated explanation of the relationship between deterritorialization, which is to say the detachment of a sign from a particular initial context, and reterritorialization, the repurposing of that sign into a new context. They write that, quote, under certain conditions, a virus can connect to germ cells, that is to say that the cells that transmit life, in the case of humans, sperm and egg cells, and transmit itself as the cellular gene of a complex species. Moreover, it can take flight, moving into the cells of an entirely different species, but not without bringing with it genetic information from the first host. This gene then becomes the interest that unites one species to another. So this might sound kind of complicated, but the pathogen to which they refer is an oncogenic RNA virus, that's to say a cancer-causing virus, sometimes called a type C virus. It was first discovered by Raul Benavista and George Tadaro at the National Cancer Institute in 1974, so roughly about 8 years before Deleuze and Guattari wrote their work. A peculiar feature of this virus is its ability to pass genetic information between species, even if those species are quite different from each other, in the case of the initial research between cats and baboons. So the virus here enters into the cat. It actually picks up some genetic information from the cat. The cat infects a baboon and brings with it both the viral DNA and the baboon DNA. So as the New York Times excitedly reported, this model of gene transfer complicates what Deleuze and Guattari call the arboreal or tree model of evolutionary development. This is how the New York Times puts it. The traditional view of evolution, dating from the works of Charles Darwin, is that it comes about through a succession of small changes, gradually improving the ability of a species to survive. The fossil record, however, seems to show remarkably abrupt leaps from one species into the next, with no record of gradual transition. In other words, to get back to the Deleuze abstract terminology, a gene or genetic sequence from a virus in one host is deterritorialized, taking flight, moving into the cells of an entirely different species. But in so doing, it brings with it re-territorializing information from its previous host. For Deleuze and Guattari, this elaborate give and take creates one of their famous rhizomes, quote, operating immediately in the heterogeneous and jumping from one already differentiated line, to say a cat, to another, a baboon. We form a rhizome with our viruses, they conclude, or rather, our viruses cause us to form a rhizome with other animals. We evolve and die more from our polymorphous and rhizomatic flus than from hereditary diseases, or diseases that have their own line of descent. This representation of human, non-human genetic networks, or rhizomes, dovetails with Wald's model of human engagement with community. Viruses, like language or other sign systems, compel us to enter into rhizomes with other communities in the process of coevolution. Departing from Wald's focus, however, which is centered around humans, Deleuze and Guattari suggest that viral outbreaks create rhizomatic communities, not only between people, but also between species. By calling attention to this weird type C virus, Deleuze and Guattari imply that we may not only be forced to join, but also in the process begin to consciously imagine a genetic community that includes both humans and non-humans. So it's here that I want to introduce the more specific claims about the subject of my talk today, the global SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, which is brought about by a virus originating in horseshoe bat populations before spreading into human populations. As I will argue, the epidemiological history of this world-changing virus offers many opportunities to rethink our relationship to the non-human world around us. This history might remind us that because of our shared genetic heritage, humans and other animals are equally subject to microbial infection, and the diseases that affect non-human communities have clear analogs in and often cross over into human communities. Indeed, recent reports of the monkeypox outbreaks in the United States and in Europe kind of throw this into relief. This very perspective has been the driving force behind recent One Health initiatives within the medical and veterinary sciences, which call for a new interspecies vision for managing medical education, clinical care, disease surveillance, and public health decisions. In its 2008 report, One Health, A New Professional Imperative, the Veterinary Association reminded its audience of the epidemiological threats to both communities' patients. This is quite prescient from 2008, so roughly 14 years ago. Of the 1,461 diseases now recognized in humans, approximately 60% are due to multi-host pathogens characterized by their movement across species lines. And over the last 3 decades, approximately 75% of new emerging human infectious diseases have been zoonotic. That is to say, they cross over between animal populations and human populations. Our increasing interdependence with animals and their products may well be the single most critical risk factor to our health and well-being with respect to infectious diseases. These efforts, in other words, might throw into relief how to the broader public, how intertwined our worlds are, highlighting the fact that the health and welfare of our non-human community members directly affect the health and welfare of our human communities. I say might here rather than will, because as my larger book suggests, these crossover pathogens rarely generate the same questions regarding community that are asked in the context of human pathogens, like the ones that Wald describes in her work. Indeed, as I will also argue, the emerging cultural narratives of COVID tend, if anything, to reinforce the differences between the human and the non-human, and the importance of keeping those two worlds physically and conceptually separate from one another. Because these narratives are still in flux at the moment, I hope that talks such as this one will help to generate counter narratives that show why we should consider COVID as an interspecies event and what difficulties we face as students and teachers of American culture or world culture in doing so. First, to the recent history. The viral agent of the current pandemic, SARS-CoV-2, is an incredibly promiscuous virus that in a short amount of time has created a global interspecies rhizomatic network or community. Even if we now, at the end of the pandemic's fourth wave and the start in the United States of the fifth wave, rarely consider it as such. For over a decade, a precursor to the SARS-CoV-2 virus had been circulating in horseshoe bat populations in southeastern China. During November of 2019, for reasons that are still to be fully determined, a descendant of that bat virus underwent what virologists call a zoonotic crossover, or according to recent scientific papers, perhaps two crossovers, and began to quickly circulate within human populations, leading a month later to the lockdown in the city of Wuhan and the surrounding areas of China. In February of 2020, Western newspapers began to report about the strange biopolitical lockdown in the region. And in March, nations beyond China began to lock down as well. But this isn't the end of the interspecies story. As the virus quickly spread across the globe, infecting tens of millions of people, it also underwent a series of reverse zoonotic crossovers from human populations to animal populations. Now, given how deadly the virus was to human beings and how severe public health measures were for containing the virus, these crossovers were devastating to animals within our communities. In June of 2020, for example, SARS-CoV-2 was discovered in mink farms in the Netherlands, and over 1 million of these animals were killed to contain the disease. A month later, another 100,000 mink were killed in Spain, and in late 2020, the largest producer of mink in the world, Denmark, culled 15 million mink to stave off viral transmission, a controversial policy that led to the resignation of its agricultural minister. Such spillovers are not unique to mink. As the CDC reported in June 2021, a number of wild and domestic animals can be infected with the virus, including dogs, hamsters, pigs, cats, and rabbits. Over the last year and a half, the disease also passed to a wide variety of zoo animals, including gorillas, tigers, lions, and snow leopards. More recently, in early 2022, that is to say at the beginning of this year, scientists in the Midwest in the United States reported that roughly 40% of the white-tailed deer population in the area had COVID antibodies in their blood samples. As a recent paper in the journal Nature suggests in the typically understated prose of science, quote, the potential establishment of a new reservoir of SARS-CoV-2 viruses in white-tailed deer could open up new pathways for evolution. This is, echoing Deleuze and Guattari in a weird way. Transmission to other wildlife species and potential spillback of novel variants to humans that human immune systems have not previously encountered. Indeed, such crossovers may already have played a role in the proliferation of COVID variants over the last few months. The most recent, I guess like the second most recent, now with B2A being the most recent, the most recent Omicron variant, for example, displayed such a staggeringly high number of new mutations in its spike protein that many scientists have proposed that the variant may have evolved within mice or rat populations before being transmitted back to humans. The territorialization, re-territorialization, and deterritorialization is expected to continue for the foreseeable future. But even species that were not capable of transmitting the virus felt its effects. After COVID-19 forced the closure of slaughterhouses in the United States, for example, over 10 million chickens were depopulated, to use the terms of animal management. While in China, restrictions on the importation of animal feed encouraged Chinese factory farmers to slaughter at least 100 million chicks. Due to a similar industrial consolidation of slaughterhouses in the United States, the temporary closure of the country's cattle and pork plants in the first few months of the COVID-19 lockdowns also had farmers considering the euthanasia of millions of these animals, with the state of Minnesota going so far as to secure 2 80-acre sites to house the expected carcasses of millions of pigs. Now, arguments can be made, of course, that many of these hundreds of millions of slaughtered animals would have been killed regardless of the virus's circulation. The tens of millions of slaughtered mink, for example, would have ended up in the coats and hats of people had they not been euthanized and buried. But even those with little interest in animal welfare would probably agree that killings on such a large scale, tens and hundreds of millions of animals, that serves no purpose beyond the containment of disease, throws into relief problems with the current structures of human-animal relationships and the many ways in which animal welfare shapes human welfare. So Linda Gregerson's poem, If the Cure for AIDS, Sick, draws our attention to this cascading set of effects. And because it's such an important poem for the purposes of my talk, I want to quote it in full right here. If the cure for AIDS, said someone in that earlier pandemic, were a glass of clean water, we couldn't save half the people here. If half the workers at Tyson Meats come down with the virus, we still have a plan for protecting the owners from lawsuits. If the phone in the farmhouse rings when it's long past dark and the milk, if the tanks of the co-op are full, if milk dumped into the culvert makes you think of death. My neighbor drove to Lansing in his pickup. I expect you've seen the photos too, the State House floor, the rifles. He had just culled half his herd. And while we're casting about for ways to summon normal, I've been watching footage of the day-old chicks, the 116,000 buried alive. It seems we can't afford the feed or can't afford the falling price of chicken. I'm mostly confused by the articles meant to explain, look at the spill of them. Dump truck into the pre-dug ditch, the mewling yellow spill of them all. A still in the down we find adorable, red earth, impassive skyscape, skittering bits of agitation on the body of the whole. So after initially framing COVID alongside the failed governmental response to the earlier AIDS epidemic, Gregerson quickly turned to the economic consequences of meat and dairy plants shutting down in the state of Michigan, my hometown, my home state. And in fact, Gregerson was one of the first professors that I ever had the pleasure of working with at the University of Michigan way back in 1996. So the consequences are starting with a farm dumping milk into the culvert because it couldn't be processed for sale. While half of the workers at the plant become infected with the virus, the poet writes witheringly, we still have a plan for protecting the owners from lawsuits. But no such plan is available to the farmers, however. As she writes, my neighbor drove to Lansing in his pickup. I expect you've seen the photos to the State House floor, the rifle. He had just culled half his herd. Now here, Gregerson alludes to the right-wing protests at the Michigan Capitol building on April 15th and April 29th, 2020. I'm not sure how much of that coverage got over to Poland, but on the second day of the protests, dubbed the American Patriot Rally, hundreds of demonstrators, many of them armed, male and predictably maskless, entered the building to protest Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's stay-at-home orders during the initial kind of lockdown. While later events, such as the discovery of a plot to kidnap Whitmer in October 2020, and a couple months later, the attacks on the US Capitol building on January 6th, 2021, have vastly altered the manner by which we now remember these early protests, making them seem far afield from the concerns of animals. Gregerson's surprising, enjambed final line, doubly emphasized by the spilling from one stanza over into another, recasts narratives surrounding that protest as an effect, in part, of farmer trauma. Unlike the owners of the Tyson factories who plan for protecting the owners from lawsuits in the event that, quote, half the workers in the plant come down with the virus, the speaker's neighbor only has the presumed instrument of his herd's culling, which brings the threat of violence inflicted upon animals into the realm of human affairs. That violence spills back into the animal world in the second half of the poem, which presents in gruesome detail what the depopulation of farmed animals looks like. I've been watching the footage of the day-old chicks, the 116,000 buried alive. Seems we couldn't afford the feed. So by cycling between a variety of perspectives in the second half of the poem, you, I, and we, Gregerson's speaker offers a variety of vantage points from which to view this awful cull. The we in the poem shifts from farmers who make the brutal economic decision to cull the flock to preserve the farm, to a broader population who humanizes the baby chicks and finds them adorable. Likewise, the lyric I think the most sympathetic voice in the poem, can only watch, confused, as the mechanics of industrial farming under pandemic conditions plays out. And in this confusion, the speaker resembles the creatures of the final image of the poem, the terrified chicks being buried alive, recast from the telescopic vantage point as skittering bits of agitation, dwarfed by the larger body of the whole, aligned with the we elsewhere. So what these events and state-sponsored killings suggest is that once again, it's too easy to distinguish the social and political worlds of human activity from the social world of non-humans around us. Though the lockdown certainly suspended human activity for a period of months, even during that time period, humans and animals continued to shape each other's worlds, with Gregerson's speaker bearing witness to her own fears through the destruction of animals around her. This process recalls Priscilla Wald's discussion of the word contagion in her aforementioned work. Contagion, she reminds us, means to touch together with all of its attendant possibilities and problems. As she argues, if contagion involves contact of a physical or ideological nature, the easiest way to stave off this threat, to stop thinking about the horrifying, skittering bits of agitation on the body of a whole, is to set up prophylactic or defensive systems, both physical and ideological, to keep human communities safe. Clearly, policies regarding the management of animals, like COVID-related travel restrictions on humans, have rendered this concept explicit. But storytelling can also play a profound role in bringing us closer or pushing us away from the non-human world around us. Gregerson's treatment of animals in her poem is a huge departure from the most common way that poets, essayists, and fiction writers have represented the pandemic over the last 2 years. Indeed, the vast majority of these writers view the pandemic as an incredible boon to the animal world. For example, in one of her final essays written before her untimely death, the journalist and translator Frederica Randall recounts her daily routines under the first COVID-19 lockdown in Italy from the spring of 2020. And this and all of these accounts come from a variety of the initial anthologies of COVID literature that emerged starting in the summer of 2020. Every morning at about 6 a.m., a chalky white dove lands on my bedroom windowsill and begins cooing very loudly. Beady eyes peer into the open window. Does he or she think I don't notice that a largest bird is contemplating broaching my domestic space and boasting about it? Ever since Italy was laid low by the COVID-19 virus and a countryside lockdown was ordered on March 9th, we've been hearing from the birds. Mill was certainly not the only writer whose eyes and ears had grown newly attuned to the non-human world around them under lockdown. The first COVID-19 poetry collection, Together in a Sudden Strangeness, America's Response to the Pandemic, and the first collection of COVID-19 essays and fiction, And We Came Outside and Saw the Stars Again, are veritable bestiaries, chock full of the sights and sounds of the animal kingdom. Writing from Paris during the lockdown, for example, the Italian novelist Giacomo Sartori notes that, quote, outside the window of my study, it looks like an aviary. I've never seen such a coming and going of birds. A multitude of cats have appeared in the streets, and the rats dart between your legs. And on the canal not far from home, a pair of swans have built their enormous nest right beside the street. and they're taking turns sitting on it. The fish in the canal are jumping like dolphins, so pleased that nobody's giving them a hard time. Likewise, in her introduction to the collection, the aforementioned collection, and we came outside and saw the stars again, Alice Quinn writes, "Here I am on the Hudson Valley, in the Hudson Valley, and a bear scrambles down Main Street, and someone captured it in a video." Poet George Bilgier offers a similar assessment in his kind of funny poem, FaceTime. "A coyote trotted down our boring little suburban street yesterday, right here in Cleveland Heights, like he owned the place. And I read that monkeys are ransacking shops in India, and jackals are wandering the streets of Tel Aviv, and water buffaloes are just kind of standing around on the empty highways of New Delhi. On the closed down Tokyo Aquarium, these tiny eels, garden eels they're called, are forgetting what we look like." Each of these breezy accounts and others like it, you see over here on the left, Emily Steinberg's Ring the Bells references this ultimately incorrect story that was circulating around Twitter in the early days of the lockdown, that dolphins had returned to Venice, that all these various cute stories that you see on the bottom, an elephant getting drunk, or a pack of elephants getting drunk, that was shared or liked almost 1 million times. All these stories and so many others that I could have introduced here suggest that the pause in human activity during the early days of the pandemic was an opportunity for the human and non-human worlds to just stop entangling with one another, to firmly separate one community of humans from another. Under different circumstances, and note, all of these stories are actually fake. They're not true, but people desperately wanted them to be true. Under different circumstances, a rogue bear or a coyote in the street of a city would signify disease or danger. But under the early lockdown conditions of COVID-19, these same animals became anthropomorphized, intrepid explorers of a new world without us. This process of converting a terrifying transgression into a humorous one bears further attention. Though the tone with which they're described are obviously quite different, it's difficult not to draw some comparison between the initial individual animal harboring the SARS-CoV-2 virus in Wuhan and the many wild animals that invade human spaces in the early literature of COVID-19. Both sets of animals transgress our sense of geographical and corporeal boundaries between the social world of humans and the supposedly natural world of animals, with Randall's chalky white dove threatening to broach her domestic space in the same way that the virus from the bat or the pangolin or the civet cat broached the physical boundaries of human lungs in the fall of 2019. But the humor of Randall's piece, and Quinn's and Bilgier's and Steinberg's for that matter, depends upon the fact that humans are safely isolated away behind plates of glass and television and phone screens. This separation stands in stark contrast to a very different feeling provoked by literature that examines the site of zoonotic crossover, the Hunan seafood market in Wuhan, China. Consider Every Day, a widely circulated poem on the Chinese social media site WeChat, written by a COVID nurse in Wuhan, Wei Shuyan. Shuyan's speaker begins the poem by asking who or what is responsible for this horrid plague. Right now, everyone knows that a bat is responsible for the poison, and calling the crime poisoning is stretching it lightly. The poison from 17 years ago is still fresh in my memory. Today is a carbon copy of yesterday, but the poison isn't yesterday's poison. People's pampering gave rise to its cunning. Strong contagion is the fruit of their pampering. Very late at night, what I most want to do is give those bats hidden in their caves steel armor to put on, engraved with the two characters Wuhan. Leave all the blades with no handles, leave all the teeth, nothing to bite. In keeping with the dominant zoonotic narrative of the time period, now largely confirmed, Shuyan initially traces the source of the outbreak to horseshoe bat populations, but the language she uses to describe the spillover is far from neutral. In recasting the virus as a poison, the poem suggests the bat is not merely a passive carrier of the virus, but is actively responsible for the human crisis. Even worse, the creature is something of a repeat offender. After all, the poison is a carbon copy of the SARS virus that led to an outbreak in the region in 2003, which also came from horseshoe bat populations and killed about 800 people throughout the world before it was contained. Like that novel coronavirus of 2019, the older SARS virus originated in those same populations in the same region of China before spilling into human populations, likely through an intermediary animal like a civet cat. The tone changes in the second half of the poem when Shuyan describes or distinguishes yesterday's poison from the present contagion, linking the latter to people's pampering and calling for animals to be armored against the teeth that would consume it, presumably from unregulated wildlife markets, such as the one in Wuhan. This recharacterization preserves the figurative structure of illness, but inverts the victim-perpetrator dynamic established at the start of the poem, suggesting that intentional human activity is somehow responsible for the novel virus. In this respect, Shuyan's attribution echoes the prophetic words of one of the discoverers of the older SARS virus from the early aughts, Kwok-Young, who wrote in 2017 that earlier SARS outbreak, quote, reinforces the notion that we should not disturb wildlife populations and never put wild animals into markets. Respecting nature is the way to stay away from the harm of emerging infections. So dovetailing Yun's move from the particular, putting wild animals into markets, to the general, respecting nature, Shuyan's general phrase, people's pampering, offers many opportunities to see the super spreader event at the seafood market as less a singular moment in the history of zoonotic disease and more a metaphor, in Susan Sontag's sense, a vehicle for a much broader set of tenors that radiates out into the larger world in a manner resembling the exponential growth of the virus itself. Following Yun and Shuyan, and keeping with Sontag's notion of a pre-modern version of disease as a kind of collective punishment from her great work, Illness as Metaphor, some authors cast COVID-19 as a synecdoche for a broader morality play of human and non-human actors. For example, the poet Rajiv Mohabir, for example, sees the viral lockdown of 2020 as a consequence of a larger anthropocentric attitude toward the natural world. It's enslavement and exploitation of the natural world that kills us, whether through zoonotic virus or by poisoning by harsh chemicals. And Javier Sine reaches a similar conclusion. The moral is that humanity invades wild habitats and nature gives it back what it deserves. Now, such views, which are the tragic counterpart to the earlier kind of humorous depictions of animals thriving in a world depopulated by humans, display an admirable commitment to addressing the many environmental problems generated by human expansion into dwindling non-human spaces. The reduction of the many animals affected by COVID to the initial figure of the avenging horseshoe bats seems to obscure the many animals that have lived alongside humans during the pandemic and whose suffering is not reducible to simplistic moralisms. This is not the only reason that we should be wary of narratives, both humorous and tragic, that frame the non-human world as separable, physically or conceptually, from the human world. As I've tried to demonstrate, our communities are and have always been composed of multiple species, united by a shared sense of vulnerability. And efforts to obscure this fact prevent us from getting on with the work of figuring out what we want our multi-species community to look like. As One Health practitioners warn us, and as the history of the COVID-19 pandemic suggests, zoonotic crossovers will become increasingly prevalent during the 21st century, as our human population and its need for protein sources increase, as climate change and deforestation drive animals into areas of increasing contact with humans, and as we continue to seek out and monitor viruses with the potential for zoonotic crossover. Thus, it is also likely that as a set of talented authors begin to write more enduring accounts of COVID-19, a new protozoonotic pathogen is likely quietly circulating in an animal population somewhere in the world, raising not only new risks for human populations and the civil societies that they assemble and maintain, but also new questions about the ways that we concentrate animals, the way that we profit from them, and the way that we treat their illnesses. Indeed, late last month, this is before the monkeypox subject that's been circulating over the last 2 days, a person in the United States tested positive for H5N1, bird flu that had been circulating in North America since earlier in the year. That person became infected while in the process of culling poultry at a factory farm in the area. And over 37 million turkeys and chickens have been slaughtered to prevent that virus from spreading more fully into wild bird populations. So it's therefore well worth following how our global culture documents this 2-year pandemic, what it means, who is responsible, and what new models of human, non-human relationships it might enable. While the early literature of COVID-19 marvels or trembles at the non-human world beyond us, I look forward to a new set of stories that, like Gregerson's poem, remind us that our worlds are never that separate from one another, even and especially during pandemics. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ray. We have quite a bit of time for a Q&A, so we might start our Q&A right now. And since I'm already unmuted myself, maybe I can ask one of the first questions. First of all, thank you, Ray, for a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I really like this kind of you bringing this kind of the Lysenko-Tarian perspective into your talk. And I was kind of thinking about different. I was thinking about Rosie Braidotti and her book on the posthuman from 2013, when she talks about in one of the chapters how people, let's say, how human subjects relate to animals. And she kind of talks about 3 different ways. So one was this kind of Oedipalized relationship, so in which we, I don't know, we have a pet at home and we kind of treat it as a member of a family, as a son or daughter, or a kind of would-be child, or kind of like so she calls it kind of an Oedipalized or kind of Oedipal relationship. We have instrumental relationship, so this is where the animals are treated as just source material for shoes, food, medicine, you name it. And the third one, the kind of phantasmatic one, so the one in which we take animals and use them in our fantasies of, I don't know, the natural world, for instance, right? Or we kind of use them as kind of objects in our, I don't know, literature, arts, etc. And I was kind of wondering about the examples you've given, about the, you know, kind of different approaches to animals in the poems. And I was kind of wondering, in which poems or in which poets' kind of responses do you see a way out of those 3 relationships? So it's not an Oedipal one, it's not a phantasmatic one, it's not an instrumental one. It's like the one that is most, that follows those, let's say, lines of flight most, right? That kind of like that is kind of the furthest from what we've known for a long time when it comes to animal. I don't know if that makes sense as a question. I'm just kind of thinking about this, you know, can we move outside of this paradigm? And if so, which of the authors you would say do that or attempt to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks so much for it. I think that there are just a long list of authors that seem to anthropomorphize animals as a kind of stand-in for human beings. So while we're all stuck in lockdown, we're looking at the animals around us taking over our spaces, and we project ourselves into them. And I think that is humorous, but I think that humor redirects us from other questions that we could ask. So I would say, the Oedipal side, or the kind of anthropomorphizing side of the early COVID literature about animals, I don't agree with at all. I think it's actually really counterproductive. I think the only literature that I found to date, this is kind of depressing because it's supposed to be the subject of my book, is the Gregerson, which frames it in a very different way, which frames it along the lines of mutual susceptibility to suffering. And I think that that model, which is an older model actually of animal ethics that is, recently kind of returned to circulation, this, the can they suffer argument, is an argument that I think works very well in Gregerson's text as a way of showing that this disease that we've been framing in, fairly anthropocentric ways actually has this cascading set of effects that link human suffering to animal suffering in ways that I think enable us to rethink communities based upon health. I think if we do that, we can also support certain kinds of One Health initiatives that tend to view attitudes towards animal illness as of interest only when those diseases affect human populations. The knock against One Health right now is that veterinary scientists and medical doctors are getting a lot of money to surveil animals because of the fact that they could have this potential effect on human populations. I think it's unfortunate because I think other narratives need to step in here to talk about the ways in which humans actually present epidemiological threats to animals, right? So we have tendencies when we talk about zoonotic disease to view the animals as the enemy, and the animals that need to be monitored, and their habits need to be changed in some way. And I think that's unfortunate because the vast majority, for example, of the swine flu from a couple decades ago, though it was called the swine flu, so many more humans infected pigs than pigs affected humans. So, just to kind of wrap up that question, sorry, I went on a little bit long there, but I think that the shared vulnerability model is what I'm going to be looking for in the new literature, the more mature literature that begins to emerge that's centered around COVID-19 over the next decade.
Thank you, Ray. I think it's a great kind of way of putting this kind of shared vulnerability as a way of moving outside those kind of known paradigms of interacting with animals, and it's just something that just kind of finishing up maybe this when we're reading some of the poems, I was thinking about how often this kind of, let's say, literature of extinction, which is supposed to be, kind of imagining like what happens after we end, after humans end, like so much of it is so anthropocentric still, like, this nostalgia, the loss, the longing, even this kind of misanthropic hate for humans. It's still misanthropic, like it's still humans at the center. So even this kind of this type of literature doesn't really move away from kind of humans. So it's interesting that it's the empathy and vulnerability that might be the answer here, right? Not thinking about removing the humans or fantasizing what happens when the human is not there, but rather what happens when we are all in this together, like literally. So we have a question from Grzegorz Kość.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you, Ray, for this really interesting talk. My question is, I'm thinking, and I've been turning it over for a long time, the status of poetry as a practice, because you've talked about poems. I'm wondering if is poetry in the avant-garde of this new thinking about animals and One Health idea, and the kind of a new, different, revamped relationship between humans and animals? Because I'm sure you read poetry, prose, but you also read scientific articles on the subject. Would you say that poetry sort of trudges along and sort of falls behind some of the more energetic initiatives coming from sciences or from prose writers? You see, basically my question is poetry a practice that sort of places you in a position where you can think really intelligently about these things, because it's such a practice, or poetry simply reflects a kind of a wider movement, and there is nothing particularly lively about poetry. It just happens that some people write poems and they don't do anything else, but they simply sort of reflect those new discourses about one health, or about a different relationship between humans and animals. So that's my question. Would you say that?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if I can answer this in terms of form, but I can answer it in terms of the kind of historical archive that I've been building that extends kind of beyond the 21st century interest in COVID to looking at other kinds of animal illnesses. I know that certainly in the book project begins in the 18th century and then kind of continues on through the 19th century and the 20th century in terms of representations of animal disease. And I think that, again, I'm kind of speculating here, but there's an overabundance of poetry associated with animals suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a relative paucity of accounts in narrative form, in long novels and short stories that address these issues. So your question is really interesting because I don't know why that is. I don't know if that's coincidental, or if there's something about the form and the fact that poetry can move in a lyric sense more quickly than the novel can, so that they can ultimately attend to the immediacy of the present in ways that the novel cannot. I hope that given the fact that narratives associated with reverse zoonosis are circulating in newspapers now, much more so than certainly pre-COVID, that perhaps poets who are writing to the moment, writing in ways that novelists can't, about the immediacy of a particular moment within the pandemic, might be able to then start addressing these issues in ways that Gregerson has done so. So maybe it is a question of form, but I know that in the research that I've done in other centuries, if those animal pandemics or epizootics, as they're called, if those epizootics resemble cultural responses, if the cultural responses to COVID in any way dovetail those, I think we should look to poetry as a leader, actually, in representing these new kinds of human-animal communities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
It's not an uplifting topic, but I think it's a really important one, because we tend to, in the midst of our lockdown, we think that the story of animals in COVID is a story that ended sometime in the fall of 2019, and it really doesn't. and animal populations, so many animal populations suffered and continue to suffer. And I think given the ways in which the COVID variants are progressing right now and moving into and out of so many different species, that white-tailed deer population, it's very much, I think, calls out for cultural representation of these kinds of exchanges.
If I may, and I don't necessarily, I think I do not have a question, but what you're saying makes me kind of process something. So to what you've just said, I'm wondering, is this what pandemic has done to animals, or rather what humans in the pandemic have done to animals? Is this, do you think, a difference in type or extent of impact? Because it's like humans do not need pandemic to be cruel to animals, to kill them at large numbers for reasons that are not necessarily justifiable. We impact habitats of animals, we depopulate, we behave in a way that both directly and indirectly affect animal existence. So I'm wondering, in our long history of interacting with animals, and in the most part probably making that existence worse rather than better, like, is the 2 years of pandemic a interesting moment because of some unique difference, or is this just like, I'm wondering about the uniqueness of that moment in the scale of violence, exploitation, depopulation of animals that we have been engaged in and benefit from, for a while now. And it's not to challenge, I'm not trying to challenge what you did to the poems, because I love those readings, and I do agree that they really make me think, and especially in those models of interaction that you mentioned in response to Agnieszka. But I'm just wondering about like the larger context. Mm-hmm. And I know it's not a very lucid question, but you've made me kind of think about the kind of unique versus universal.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the most recent pandemic is it's taking place at a time that we've only really been talking in medical literature, at least as far as I know, about these kinds of crossover events for a limited number of decades. Most of which were concentrated on zoonotic crossovers from animal populations to human populations, and only very recently, as I say, like even the term reverse zoonosis, the idea that humans could affect other animals, could infect them, could be like the kind of, with all of its attendant Sontagian metaphors of dirtiness, that we could be the agent of that threatens other populations, both within our livestock, but also within our homes, our domestic pets, and whatnot. I think that COVID has intensified those discussions, has focused them to a particular point not through the culture narratives, which I don't think are engaging with it yet, but through journalistic accounts in ways that I think offer us an opportunity of seeing relationships between humans and animals in a different way, that would potentially, and this is what I was trying to get at the end, if you could see yourself as a threat to animals, like a viral threat to animals, that wasn't possible 30 years ago, wasn't possible 20 years ago. And if you do, then you see yourself, and you see in this kind of Latourian sense, when things break down, you can see the relationships between yourself and the animals around you in slightly different ways. And I hope that the new way of looking at the world, the new way of understanding, our place both individually and collectively within larger ecosystems. I hope that will be one of the positive things that does come out of the pandemic, that we start asking these larger questions about, how we tend to concentrate animals, what are the consequences of the actions that we're continuing to take individually and collectively to ensure that zoonotic crossovers, increase as we move into a very strange time in human history.
Thank you.
So I'm hoping that the breakdown in a kind of Latourian sense will enable us to ask these other questions as well that move, that preserve this notion of like shared vulnerability, but move beyond a purely epidemiological framework for that, to talk about larger environmental issues that we're all in the process of starting to confront right now.
if I may add, and like a recommendation that I just seen in terms of shared vulnerability, there's a new documentary by Andrea Arnold called Cow, which has, I think, an attempt to have the camera empathize with a cow called Bluma. It's a and very interesting artistically and probably politically film. So just like
was this discussed in one of the earlier colloquia?
Yeah.
it's a different one.
Oh, different.
Yes, you're thinking of Annette Pick's presentation, and
Right.
yes, she was talking about this vegan film or vegan film analysis, and but this was a feature film, and I am talking about a documentary now by Andrea
Okay.
Arnold called Cow, that is a new release. But yeah, I think that there are some similarities in representation in both, but I think that given what I've heard from you, and especially this commonality of vulnerability, I think viewing of Cow might be something of interest.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And please, everyone out there in Zoom land, if you do have any suggestions, I'm still in the process of building that archive, and because the literature of COVID is such a moving target right now, I'm assuming that there'll be, there are all these predictions by the New Yorker and New York Times, like the next year we'll see a kind of avalanche of material. If you do find something that engages with, I really, it's not like the point of academia is a little bit different than the point of Twitter, but I think at the same time, there's a place in academia for boosting certain kinds of narratives, as an increasing number of people try to start engaging with the literature of illness. I think it's going to be really important for future teachers, for future classes to engage with illness in a kind of multi-species way, rather than fully separating out one from the other. So yeah, Andrea Arnold's Cow, I'm definitely going to check that out. Thank you so much for the recommendation.
If I may say something, I've been, I'm trying to sort of wrap up my mind around this idea. And one thing that your talk made me think of was that our lives have been very much de-animalized. Like, for instance, when I look at my own experience, my grandfather had horses, cows, livestock animals of all kinds, chicken, ducks, and so on and so forth. Now we have technologies to keep away birds. I have one cat, and a cat that there's no way really to let it traverse and explore nature out there. So it's a domestic cat. But also very much of our viral cloud, if you say so. And the horseshoe bat food, right? As food. I mean, I understand there are no horseshoe bat farms. That it's a kind of a small scale cuisine practice, right? It's not industrially processed food. So I'm wondering, is it because the zoonotic virus has recently been, or the zoonotic viral diseases have recently been conceptualized? Because do you see, I'm just wondering, why are we having problems now that our lives have become quite separate from the lives of animals, much more so than they were in the past, and then the cases we have identified. So the virus, the most deadly virus, it turns out, came from a horseshoe bat, and it's not the kind of meat that I would normally associate with mass production and mass consumption.
I think the bigger, the more probable threats seems like the SARS-CoV-2 was was a spectacularly unusual case there. It seems like the much more common cases that you read about in terms of 1980s and 1990s and early aughts are associated with viruses that are passed in these concentrated areas. So if you think of the late 90s avian flu scares that were coming out of areas where you have concentrations, like immense concentrations of farmed chickens that are living in close proximity to large populations of wild birds. And certain, one of the areas I think in that late 90s outbreak was this area, the Guangdong area in China, where you have like an enormous concentration of hundreds of millions of chickens. And you have also migratory birds that collect in these areas. And the relationship between those two populations.
Gotcha. Yeah. So this problem has been with us for a long time. COVID has made us aware of the problem, but that said, COVID-19 in and of itself may not be the best example of this phenomenon.
Yeah, the rest of my book, actually, when you talk about like the large scale epizootic diseases that have ravaged North America and Europe over the last 4 centuries, they really correspond to the modernization of Europe and now global agriculture. So you have this is the argument that I make elsewhere in the book. You've got the kind of birth of modernity in Europe in the 1700s, corresponding to like enormous population growths within European countries that call out for a more industrialized, proto-industrialized concentration of cattle, and this corresponds to the kind of first and second and third waves of this cattle disease called rinderpest, which is very much the product of concentrations of the way in which we tend to concentrate in unnatural ways livestock populations. Mm-hmm. So I think the way in which that kind of filters into COVID is not from like the strange crossover. However, we may never know how it got from horseshoe bat populations to human populations, but once it got into our population, we are so concentrated as a species, and we're interacting with so many other species in high levels of concentration, especially at these enormous factory farms like mink farms, pig farms, chicken farms, and whatnot. That I think more effort needs to be made at the very least in terms of figuring out ways of rethinking the manner by which we concentrate animals into these enormous populations that make transmission of the virus inevitable, and that leads certain kinds of government agencies across the world to say, like, the solution to the problem is to kill every single animal because they're concentrated in such areas, and they're concentrated in such a way that we can't prevent the spread of this disease. I think there are other. I'm not an agricultural businessman, but I would imagine that there are other ways in which you can organize animals to kind of mitigate this, and there are other ways in which you could also tell consumers your interest in paying a certain amount of money for chicken, has epidemiological effects. Do you want this? Do you want hundreds of millions of animals slaughtered every couple of years? Because it does seem like, there's the current culling that's taking place in the United States right now of like 37 million chickens and turkeys, for a different virus, different than SARS, because of these kinds of immensely transformed ways of thinking about animals. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I think we can maybe stop here. I think we've kind of covered quite a few interesting areas. And thanks again, everyone. Have a great evening and see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.